With the official release of Episode 8's title, Star Wars The Last Jedi, there's been the accompanying speculation about what it might mean. Will Luke Skywalker die as the Last Jedi? Will Rey be trained and be left the Last Jedi upon Luke's death? If Orbalist Darth Bane was included in Season 3 of the Clone Wars, would the evil Empire have been forced to make the Bane trilogy canon? Although it's still early, I believe that there is good evidence that exists that explains the meaning behind the new title, and rather than alluding to Luke's death, it foreshadows change in his approach to the Force. In this video expose, I will describe why Luke must be the Last Jedi, and explain why this means that he will start to incorporate elements of the dark side into his training, thereby breaking away from the traditional practices and teachings of the Jedi Order. It's necessary to start with the fact that following Order 66 and the rise of the Galactic Empire, it's clear that the Jedi got it wrong. For all of their commitment and adherence to the light side of the Force, and their complete abstaining from any element that was connected to the dark side, it was useless in preventing the Sith's grand plan and the manipulations of Darth Sidious. In fact, in a lot of ways, their sole commitment to the light was actually a hindrance in this regard. As Yoda recognized during his duel with Sidious, the brighter his light, the darker the shadow of the Sith. This is to say that from his vantage point within the light, he couldn't even comprehend the darkness, let alone see it. While standing only within the light, he allowed the darkness to hide within the shadows. As to Yoda and the rest of the Jedi Order, he could only see light. But this isn't the only important aspect that Yoda realized after the emergence of Sidious. Yoda recognized that the Jedi Order had not evolved in its principles or understanding in 1,000 years. They were still the same order that existed a millennium prior. What made this so dangerous was that where the Jedi remained stagnant, the Sith and the entire galaxy had changed. While engaging Sidious in lightsaber combat, Yoda understood that the Sith had grown, had adapted, had spent 1,000 years studying every aspect of the Force, thereby remaking themselves in the process and becoming new. On the other hand, the Jedi were still the Jedi of old. This was a significant realization for Yoda, and he placed the blame squarely upon himself, as he was forced to admit that the old way of the Jedi was not the only way, and that the Force was an infinite mystery that still left much to learn. An interview that has always stuck with me was a March 2014 interview with the God Emperor Dave Filoni, discussing Yoda in the final arc of Season 6 of the Clone Wars, wherein he stated, "So you understand that, fundamentally, what a Jedi is during the Clone Wars and the prequel era is different than what Yoda, Qui-Gon, and eventually Obi-Wan understand is the truth of being completely selfless." Clearly, there's an understanding among the surviving Jedi, particularly Yoda, following Order 66 and the rise of the Empire, and for good reason, that the Jedi had to evolve, and that the ways of old were no longer effective. Whether Yoda was able to pass a new way on to Luke isn't known yet, but what we do know is that Yoda was open to change following the destruction of the Jedi Order, and certainly wasn't the same person in The Empire Strikes Back, as Filoni further intimates in his March 2014 interview. Further, we know that Luke went through a very similar situation as the Jedi before him, that is, experiencing the complete annihilation of the Order due to a former member having fallen to the dark side. Certainly, it appears that the Jedi are still in need of some changes. But you may be asking, Non-Canon Expert, it might be clear that the Jedi Order needs to evolve through a few Legends quotes and statements from the God Emperor, but what demonstrates that Luke will start to incorporate elements of the dark side from the current canon? The most important aspect is the reintroduction of the Journal of the Whills into the canon through the Force Awakens novelization. Included in the Episode 7 novelization is the following passage. "First comes the day, then comes the night. After the darkness shines through the light. The difference, they say, is only made right by resolving of gray through refined Jedi sight." The passage clearly makes references to the light and dark sides of the Force, as well as the Jedi. But breaking down the verse seems to suggest that there's a connection to the events of galactic history that have been shown in the films. "First comes the day, then comes the night," appears to allude to the rise of the Galactic Empire and the control of the galaxy by Sidious, an apparent changing of the guard from Jedi to the Sith. "After the darkness shines through the light" represents the actions of Luke Skywalker and the redemption of the fallen chosen one, Anakin Skywalker, thereby ending the darkness of the Empire and Sith. The next elements are the most interesting, as the verses, "The difference, they say, is only made right by the resolving of gray through refined Jedi sight," seems to suggest that the difference between the light and dark can only be resolved through the Jedi revising and changing their approach to the Force, wherein they must adopt the point of view of gray. Of course, when speaking of gray in terms of the Force, this means the acceptance of both the light and dark. The verse appears to foreshadow the fact that Luke will be refining the approach of the Jedi that changes the Order's traditional approach of accepting only the light and skewing everything even remotely approaching the dark side, thereby accepting dark side elements. Taking the verse literally as a representation of events in galactic history is not a significant stretch, as in Legends, the Journal of the Wills was exactly that, a legendary record of events that occurred in the galaxy. In fact, originally, George Lucas planned to use the journal as a plot device, wherein the stories of the films were told by the journal's keeper, as recorded and relayed to the keeper by R2-D2 100 years after the Battle of Endor. Therefore, it's entirely possible that this plot device has been reintroduced, just like the journal, and the verse perfectly foreshadows Luke resolving the difference between the light and dark by refining his approach to the Force and accepting the elements of the dark side, signifying an important break in Jedi tradition. But even if the verse is not to be taken literally in this way, it's still possible that it represents an important teaching that pushes Luke into adopting dark side elements. The journal's verse may have been created by ancient Jedi, teaching that the Force could only be made right if the Jedi accepted both the light and dark sides. The Journal of the Wills may have been found by Luke in his travels with Lor San Tekka to seek out Jedi lore. This would allow Luke to have learned of the passage, and coupled with everything he knows relating to the falls of Anakin and Kylo, convinced him to refine his understanding of the Force and accept the dark side in some respect. Either way, I believe that this verse is important to Luke becoming the Last Jedi in regard to his approach to the Force, whereby he moves away from the traditional Jedi practices and incorporates the dark side. The fact that Luke would incorporate the dark side, thereby accepting both the light and dark, isn't surprising given the different perspectives that have recently been added into the canon. For example, the ancient Force-worshipping order of the Guardians of the Wills, to which Chirrut Îmwe was a member of, rejected the Jedi approach to the Force and thought that no single individual or order could fully hold a monopoly on understanding the Force, thereby suggesting that multiple perspectives were necessary. More importantly, the Guardians differed greatly from the Jedi by rejecting that the light and dark sides existed in perpetual discord, that is, as competing and diametrically opposed sides. Rather, the Guardians thought that one should attempt to understand the totality of the Force, both its lightness and its darkness. The Guardians of the Wills were not the only ancient order that accepted the light and dark. As we've seen in Season 3 of Rebels, the Bendu, an ancient being himself, represented the center of the Force, whereby he stood between the light and the dark sides. The Bendu suggested that only following one side of the Force created imbalance. Further, he recognized that while an object like a Sith holocron was dangerous, it had no bearing on whether someone fell to the dark side, as only an individual could choose to change and follow a certain path themselves. Kanan, on the other hand, a Jedi taught to reject anything connected to the dark side, feared the holocron, and ironically, his fear is what created the imbalance within him, and would potentially drive him to the dark side. Therefore, as seen with the Guardians of the Wills and the Bendu, there have already been orders within the Star Wars universe who've come to recognize that the Jedi approach, a singular dogmatic adherence to only the light, didn't work and rejected it. In fact, Supreme Leader Snoke and Kylo Ren appear to have evolved past the Sith in a lot of similar ways. For example, Snoke saw Kylo as the perfect embodiment of a Force warrior, because he was a focal point between the light and dark sides of the Force. It was because of this balance within Kylo that Snoke sought out and recruited him. This pushed Snoke to encourage Kylo to use both his light and dark side heritages. Further, as part of his training, Kylo learned from the teachings of both the light and dark sides, studying both the lore of the Jedi and arcane dark side lore to further enhance his power. It's possible that Snoke is doing this because he recognized the same thing that Yoda recognized in his duel with Sidious. Whereas Yoda understood that his sole reliance on the light blinded him from the dark, Snoke may understand that the Sith's sole reliance on the dark made them sensitive and vulnerable to the light, as Sidious was destroyed through the redemption of Anakin back into the light. Therefore, Luke must also come to this same conclusion. He must move past the traditional teachings of the Jedi. Rather than trying to hide from the dark within the light, thereby allowing the darkness to grow and eventually being unable to even comprehend it, let alone fight it, Luke must accept elements of the dark side and ultimately make himself the Last Jedi. Roll credits. So there we have it. Why Luke Skywalker must become the Last Jedi, and how Episode 8's title alludes to Luke moving past the traditional teachings of the Jedi and begin to accept elements of the dark side. We love making these videos, so why not subscribe for more fun Star Wars theories and discussions? Also, if you enjoyed the video, think about giving a like or leaving a comment. If not for me, for being so close.